Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being with us this evening. I'm Gloria Palmer, the Executive Director of Green Mountain Academy for Lifelong Learning. I think we're in for a real treat. And if you haven't seen the art exhibit, the glass exhibit up at the Wilson Museum at the Arts Center, I encourage you to go up there. It's beautiful. And Corso joined SVAC in 2019, most recently from the Chrysler Museum of Art in Norfolk, Virginia, where she had served as the Director of Education. Prior to her tenure at the Chrysler, she was Director of Education at both the Reading, you've got it. Reading Public Museum in Pennsylvania and at the Delaware Art Museum in Wilmington. Anne holds a BA in Art History from Rosemont College in Pennsylvania and a master's in museum education from the University of the Arts in Philadelphia. Anne has participated in the nationally known Getty Leadership Institute for Executive Education, and she currently serves on the board of the Manchester Business Association and is a member of the Vermont Curators Group. And we're very happy to have you again with us, Anne. Thank you.
Wonderful. Let me see first if I can share the screen for everyone. Okay, everyone sees it. Wonderful. Well, Gloria, thank you for such a wonderful and warm introduction. I'm quite honored to be in the company of so many fabulous GMALL speakers and lecturers. I will say I'm actually very relieved that no one gets to vote on my presentation about whether it was successful or not. So
give it a thumbs up.
I'm quite happy to be able to talk about this particular subject that is near and dear to my heart. Even though I am not a glass artist per se, I've dabbled in the medium in different parts of my life. And in my various museums, worked with many, many glass artists, glass exhibitions, historical and contemporary. And so I hope that in this 1 hour talk, we will be able to explore just a taste of what this fabulous medium has offered across the world. Our artifacts, millennia from now, they might categorize our time as the glass age. How many times in a day do we in modern society interact with glass? In our architecture, in our homes, in our transportation, in our medicine, from eyeglasses to telescopes and cell phones to our happy hour beverages, we touch glass hundreds of times a day. It's so ubiquitous that we often take it for granted. So what I hope to do this evening is take a tour of glass specifically as an art form. Just that topic alone spans more than 4,000 years, and archaeological discoveries are pushing back that timeline very, very frequently. So what is glass? What is this wonderful material made from? Well, if it's been a while since you've sat in a chemistry class, here's the simplest, very, very simplest version. There are 3 primary ingredients in glass. Ancient glass, modern glass, doesn't quite matter. Silica, or what we know as sand, is the base, makes up almost 3/4 of the material. Soda ash reduces the melting point, that's important. And lime acts as a flux that helps glass to be melted and shaped. Now, the addition of various oxides or minerals, just like in paints, are responsible for the coloration. So, for instance, some of these will sound very familiar to you. Cobalt, of course, is for blue. Manganese dioxide is for purple. Gold chloride is for red. Iron oxide for green and brown. Tin for white, and so on. But of course, the most important ingredient in glass is heat. And glass, as most of you know, is solid in its cooled form and viscous or almost liquid at its highest temperatures. And in modern glass blowing studios, not necessarily industrial production, glass furnaces run at about 2,400 degrees Fahrenheit and are manipulated at just a slightly lower temperature, around 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So glass blowing is not the only glass process, but more about that in future slides. So the secret of making glass was discovered over 4,000 years ago, in about 2200 BC, or before the Common Era, in Mesopotamia, likely as an outgrowth of workshop experiments with glazes for other materials like stone, clay, or faience. Early glass workers cast that raw material into colorful but very, very small objects: beads, amulets, cylinder seals, even inlays for other processes. And often glass served as a substitute for more costly imported gemstones. About 500 years later, small vessels started to be fabricated using a core technique, first in northern Mesopotamia and later in Egypt. The three ancient vessels illustrated here are the types of things that were found in royal palaces and graves, and proof that they were luxury goods made for kings or nobles or the higher echelons of society by very, very skilled artisans. The bottle and jar held perfumed oils, things for rituals, and would have been closed with a linen and wax stopper rather than a glass lid. And of course, the palm-shaped vessel would have held kohl, which was an eye cosmetic. Now, as I mentioned, these vessels were made by a core forming process. And that technique was what was most commonly used before traditional glass blowing. And we'll get to that in just a moment. So archaeologists believe that core forming technology started when the glass artist or the artist iron-rich clay and animal dung around a metal rod. And that shape was meant to approximate the exterior shape of the vessel. There would be some sort of parting agent, which would maybe be a crushed limestone applied to the core, and then that piece would be rolled in the hot glass, and the hot glass would be shaped over a marver, a hard stone or a hard metal surface, to roll the piece into shape. The artist would reheat and work the object until they got it into the desired form, when it would be removed and cooled or annealed in sort of a primitive oven. In ancient Egypt, we have examples of portraiture rather than vessels, but these would have been rather than functional objects. They would have been also buried in tombs, but for a different purpose, and of course to honor the dead or the pharaohs that they are depicting. So on the left, you see a portrait of King Amenhotep from about 1400 BCE. Now this was in faience, which was an early precursor to glass, but faience was a type of clay that was glazed with a glass-like substance. And then on the right, we see the portrait inlay of the pharaoh Akhenaten from just less than a century later. Now, while core forming continued throughout the Mediterranean, it was really the Romans who revolutionized glass. And it seems that the Roman glass industry sprang up from almost nothing and developed into full maturity over a couple of generations in that short a period, around the 1st century AD. So Rome's emergence as the political and economic power in the Mediterranean was certainly a factor in attracting skilled craftspeople and setting up workshops. And this invention really revolutionized glass production, putting it on par with other major industries like pottery and metalware. And the glass blowing technique allowed the craft artist a much greater variety of shapes than ever before with other mediums. And combined with kind of the inherent attractiveness of glass, glass is non-porous, it's translucent, it's odorless, and this kind of adaptability encouraged people to actually change their tastes and their eating and drinking habits. And glass cups for drinking started replacing pottery and metal vessels that really might have impacted the beverages that they were drinking. So here we see two types of glass-blown vessels from the 1st century in the Roman period. On the right is a free blown beaker, and on the left is a mold-blown beaker. The difference, or mold-blown vessel, I should say, the difference in those two processes is kind of what you're intuiting. In most molten glass processes, you will have a hollow blowpipe where glass is gathered from a hot furnace. That molten glass is gathered on the end. And in both instances, the artisan will inflate a bubble, inflate the glass by blowing into the blowpipe. And that creates an expansion of the material and gives you that, that hollow form. So with a free-form vessel, the piece is just shaped either by rolling the molten glass onto a marver or stone and put in and out of the furnace until the desired shape is made. Now with a mold-blown object, it's mostly the same. The artist would gather glass on the hollow blowpipe, but when they inflate the glass, they would be doing so in a mold. And often that mold may be made of wood, may be made of clay, often have a coating that would help release the glass, would have some sort of on it that imprinted itself into the glass. So on the piece on the left, if you look very carefully, you can almost see the inscription in Greek lettering of the artist who made it, Enyen. You can sort of make out the E, the Greek E, the ends, and a little bit of the other letters below. So one of the remarkable things about Roman glass blowing is that it served as the primary method and primary technique for almost 2,000 years. Now, granted, some aspects have changed. Fuel is more efficient, temperatures are more easily able to be regulated, the scale has evolved, artists today can work much bigger, but it's essentially unchanged. And so here, the two illustrations, on the left is a 17th century etching of a glass blowing or a glass heating furnace. And on the right, what you see is a recreation with some of the folks from the Corning Museum of Glass of what a Roman furnace would have looked like. And just to kind of illustrate further the tools that were used basically in Roman glass blowing, while this illustration is an 18th century illustration, almost all of these tools are still used today. Everything from the blowpipe, which is letter A, the pontil rod, which is what takes the glass from the other end when it's on the blowpipe, the scissors and shears or jacks, which are used to manipulate or create forms, a ladle, which enables a glass artist to actually dip the hot molten glass out of the furnace and either reduce the amount of glass in the furnace or perhaps pour it into a mold. and even a fork, which would, of course, enable a glass artist to carry that piece to an annealing oven, because, of course, you're not doing so with your hands. All of those tools, almost every one of them, you would find in a modern glass blowing studio. It just shows you how absolutely incredible the Roman invention and almost how perfect it was. Now, to move through history just a little bit faster, I want to show you a couple of different kinds of glass vessels and glass objects from different time periods as well as different cultures. So what you see here is a drinking horn from probably the 8th or early 9th century that shows the decoration that was favored by Islamic artists of the period. And the artists of the Islamic world would often apply a brown or sort of yellow metal pigment on their bowls or dishes or other objects. And that decoration was usually of an animal or vegetable or floral motif. Sometimes accompanied by an inscription. And in this particular piece, you see a large applied handle. So this piece would have been a ritual vessel that would have been passed from person to person, of course, imitating what was once a traditional vessel, an actual animal's horn that is hollowed out and used for drinking. Now, another example from the Islamic world is this mosque lamp, which dates from the early 14th century. And before the introduction of electricity, lighting was an expensive luxury. So providing lighting in Islamic religious buildings was seen as kind of an act of generosity to the community that would be rewarded by God. So donors would pay for lamps and pay for the supply of the oils and wicks needed to run them. And they, of course, much like in today's philanthropic circles, those people would be acknowledged on the vessels themselves. And so in some of the script and the writing that you would see on these particular vessels, you would see donors' names, much like you see donors' names in schools, universities, and museums. So from the 12th to 16th centuries in Syria and Egypt, donors commissioned those lamps and lamp holders of glass and metal, and they were often large and impressive. So, you know, interestingly, at sort of the same time in the Christian world, and specifically for these two examples in France, it shows how glass was used in other places of worship, and specifically in cathedrals. One of the great feats of artistry and engineering of the medieval era was stained glass production. And so stained glass really kind of served a dual purpose. It was meant to illuminate the buildings. So windows were, of course, functional, first and foremost, but they also served as narratives, usually illustrating scenes from biblical texts to a population that was largely unable to read those texts. So here, an example from the Cloisters Museum at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The actual scene is one from the Legend of the Seven Sleepers, made in Rouen, right about 1200 AD, and perhaps a more recognizable scene for many of us, the panel with the Annunciation that was made in Burgundy, right about sort of the mid-15th century. So stained glass or leaded glass is what we often call a cold process as opposed to a hot process. And what that means is that the glass that was used was still created in a hot process. So roundels or discs would have been blown, and instead of being blown into a three-dimensional form, they'd be blown and flattened, and then cooled and cut and assembled. So the artisans would be working with an artist design or cartoon. So basically a very specific outline that illustrated to the artist what colors to use where and which shapes to use where. And then the glass would be cut, assembled, and fit into what are called leaded came channels. So lead, as you probably know, is a very soft and flexible metal. So imagine a lead channel that's something like a capital H, where the channels could accept the edges of glass, and those edges might have been adhered with some type of putty-like substance. Now, as you're looking at this image, the details that you see in the faces, the hands, the drapery, the angel wings, these are all actually painted on. So the thick black lines that you see are the lead channels, and the tiny sort of wispy lines, the lines that look almost thin and pen-like, are actually paint. That process didn't change much until the 19th century with the emergence of Tiffany studios. So hold on to that thought, more about that in a couple of minutes. So fast forwarding just a tiny bit, perhaps there's no area associated with glass as much as the city of Venice, and even more specifically, the island of Murano. And so while there's evidence that glass blowing existed as early as the 8th century in Venice, production didn't truly ramp up until about the 11th or 12th centuries there. And it was right around 1290, 1291 that glass blowing was permanently moved to the island of Murano to keep the furnaces away from the tightly packed wooden buildings of Venice. It was a fire hazard. So if those furnaces, those large furnaces, were isolated, it was safer for the city. So one of the attributes that made Venetian or Murano glass, and I'll use those terms interchangeably, was and collectible is the intricacy of the work. And so what we're looking at here is a piece called a Atza, and that's just Italian for cup. It's often a vessel with a large flat bowl, produced in early modern Europe in a variety of materials. They came in metal, they came in pottery, they also came in glass. And sometimes they could hold fruit or sweetmeats, but often they held red wine. And specifically red, because the shallow bowl would provide maximum contact with the air, allowing the wine to aerate and to improve its taste. Now, because of the proportions of this glass, unlike the drinking glasses that you probably have at home, the successful handling of it indicated a high level of balance, poise, and control. So often you'll see in Renaissance and Baroque paintings a particular noble woman or noble man just holding this Atza just right, because as you can imagine, it's easy to slosh or spill. Now, the Italian Renaissance coincided with the golden age of Venetian glass, when glassmakers developed a variety of innovative techniques. One of those techniques was the invention of cristallo glass. And the name takes its roots from rock crystal, because this clear glass was meant to mimic actual, rock crystal. So here we see a serpent-stemmed goblet from about the 17th century. And probably not surprisingly to you, objects like this were widely exported from Venice and widely imitated in other European countries that had glass production capabilities. And finally, I used this slide just to illustrate the sort of dizzying complexity of the intricacy of the Venetian chandelier. This particular example from the 19th century, but still very much honoring that tradition of almost, I think, to our modern sensibilities, this over-the-top decorative, if not quite bordering on gaudy decoration here. But the technical proficiency is just absolutely mind-boggling. Now, if your personal aesthetic leans a little less to the decorative and a little more to the practical, you might prefer the simple elegance of the German-made glass that you see here. This German Romer is, of course, blown glass and tinted just ever so slightly green with iron oxide. Now, there are hot globs or globules that are added to the stem and stamped with a textured pattern. The vessel itself is surprisingly large. It's at least 10 inches high and a bulbous glass to hold liquid. So the raspberry-shaped prunts, as they're called, that were impressed onto the stem while the glass was hot, were meant to help a drinker with slippery hands be able to hold the actual vessel. Because while personal sets of utensils became more common in the 17th century, many people still used their hands to eat. So certainly you don't want your 10 inches of wine slipping out of your hand and breaking your precious vessel. So more about glasses, because it's an important part of the medium. On the American continent, glass production dates back to the early days of the settlement in Jamestown, Virginia, almost back to the 1620s. But large-scale production of glass in the States didn't really become successful or sustained until the early 19th century. And so many luxury items, including glass, were imported from abroad. In the 19th century, a couple of glass manufacturers really rose to prominence in the States. And the examples that I have here on the left are Adams and Company out of Pittsburgh, who made this lovely little egg cup. I probably should have not sized it the same as the goblet, which is next to it, or the cordial glass made from the New England Glass Company. Now, these pieces would have been pressed glass. And that is exactly as it sounds. So we'll talk a little bit more about that process in just a moment. But it's an interesting bit of local history. These pieces of American glass, which are currently in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, were donated by our own local heroine, Emily Winthrop Miles. For those of you who are familiar with SVAC, Emily Winthrop Miles is the sculptress who created the bronze figures that dot the back lawn of SVAC. Aside from being an accomplished artist, she was also an avid collector of 19th century American glass and Wedgwood pottery, of all things. But perhaps to illustrate the technique of pressed glass a little bit more, these two small pieces, the covered sugar bowl and the salt bowl on the bottom, one from Boston and Sandwich Glass Company, the other New England Glass Company, gives you a sense of how the mold impacted the surface decoration and shape of the piece, but the illustration of the press on the left gives you sort of a hint at the process. So within this press, you can see sort of in the middle, there would be a mold where molten glass would have been poured into the mold. A plunger would push the glass down, forcing it into sort of the crevices of the mold. And as it was cooled enough to hold its shape, but not too cold to break, the mold would be opened and it would be further annealed in an annealing oven. Now, as you can imagine, American glass factories were, with this process, more able to make objects more quickly, to make more of them, and to reduce the price so that a greater segment of the population could afford them. Certainly more affordable than imported hand-blown glass objects. But of course, some of the companies, New England Glass in particular, were versatile enough to make more than one line. And so what I sort of call their high-end line here shows a different kind of mold-blown piece with incredibly intricate decoration, both in form and in surface decoration, with the etched surface, the paint, and the gilded leaves on top of them. Now, in the late 19th century, glass wasn't just purely functional, not by a long shot. Decorative and collectible artworks were also available for people with interest and with means. And so English cameo glass was one of the most expensive types of glass ever produced. And large plaques like these from my old stomping grounds at the Chrysler Museum of Art were extremely rare. These companion plaques called one the intruder and the other the attack, were produced by Thomas Webb and Sons and designed, more in this case, the designer was sort of the star, by George and Thomas Woodall, who were some of the most famous designers of the day. Now imagine these plaques are almost 17 inches in diameter, so massive kind of pieces that would be displayed on a wall, on a shelf. And they draw their inspiration from antiquity, not just in the subject matter of the classically draped figure in front of the Greco-Roman architecture with sort of the mischievous putti surrounding her, but also in the process of cameo glass. That was another invention of the Romans, where one layer of glass was put on top of another. So one level of glass would be worked, and then as that glass was still hot, you would put it back into the furnace and add more glass on top of it. When it was cooled, the top layer would carve skillfully, and so it would reveal with great depth the background below. And if the artisan was skilled enough, they could really create something that looked almost three-dimensional, like the pieces that you see here. Now, glass didn't exist solely in the Western world. Here we see several examples of glass production in China, from the earliest glass beads down at the bottom from the Han Dynasty at about 200 BC, the beautifully carved yellow snuff bottle, which is deceptive in size on the slide. It's probably only about 2 inches in height, from the probably second half of the 18th century. And its contemporary, the larger piece on the left, titled The Warrior Vase, shows that the Beijing Palace of Glassworks almost rivaled its European competitors. Now, interestingly, this piece here, the Warrior Vase, is also an example of cameo glass. However, the differences in this and the previous slide is, one, that it's three-dimensional, and two, the layer of glass is reversed. So the red is on top here and carved away to reveal the white opaque glass, as opposed to the Woodall example. And perhaps Japan's most famous contribution is the dazzling cut Edo glass, which dates back to the early 19th century and is an honored craft even today. But as we're kind of fast forwarding in time and as we move back to the United States, another pivotal moment in glass and another revolutionary figure in glass was that of Louis Comfort Tiffany. In the early 20th century, Tiffany Studios created a massive array of decorative home items that included mosaics, ceramics, metals, but nothing more notable than the firm's glass, and particularly stained glass. So the studio employed hundreds of designers, glassmakers, cutters, glaziers, and more. And Tiffany Studios also forged some really innovative techniques. One of those techniques was drapery glass. And we have a great example in this piece, The Woman in a Pergola, from a private commission of 1910. And so drapery glass, as you can probably imagine, is a process by which before the glass, when the glass is produced, it is manipulated in its flat form, reheated, and almost bent or molded to a point where it creates an uneven texture, a rippled texture. And so that glass, when it is cooled, has a three-dimensional effect. So the decoration that you see, rather than what we looked at in the medieval stained glass, is actually a semi-textured, a semi-three-dimensional aspect of the flat glass that gives you this kind of textural quality. And so the amount of paint on a Tiffany window is usually reduced almost to just facial features in hand. Things like water, vegetation, leaves, fabric could have been rendered with drapery glass. Now, another innovation of Tiffany Studios was the perfection of the copper foil technique, which is still a stained glass technique, but in this method, copper foil would be adhered to the edges of the cut glass pieces, and with the help of a flux, they are soldered with lead into place. This allowed for three-dimensional forms in stained glass. So you could cut and assemble pieces over a three-dimensional mold and hold them in place. And a sort of lesser known bit of Tiffany history is that a woman by the name of Clara Driscoll is actually responsible for the development of the leaded shades. She advised an entire department of women who were engaged in selecting, cutting glass for windows and mosaics. And this dragonfly lampshade is one of her documented designs. But I'd like to once again sort of fast forward to another pivotal moment in the history of glass. And by the mid-20th century, glass had been primarily produced in glass factories. Even artists who designed glass had to rely on fabricating them in larger factories. So by the 1950s, artists were looking at ways to create glass in their own studios. And the birth of the studio glass movement came with a University of Wisconsin ceramics professor, Harvey Littleton, who teamed up with a glass research scientist, Dominic Labino, and together they experimented and successfully devised a small but inexpensive furnace in which glass could be melted and worked, making it affordable for the first time and making it possible for artists to blow glass in independent studios. This sort of watershed moment happened with the support of and on the campus of the Toledo Museum of Art in 1962. That is often referred to as sort of the birth of modern glass or the birth of the studio glass movement. So originally, and here, I skipped ahead. I mentioned Harvey Littleton, the sort of father of studio glass. I show two of his pieces here. The one, the opalescent red crown, and the other, implied movement, are both in the Renwick collection. But the studio movement for which he is responsible for quickly spread not only through the States, but also through Europe, Australia, and more recently into Asia. But Harvey Littleton's students are some of the most internationally recognized glass artists of today. And one of Littleton's most accomplished students, and probably the name most of you recognize, is that of Dale Chihuly. Dale Chihuly, a Tacoma, Washington native, enrolled in Littleton's glass program at the University of Wisconsin, continued his studies at Rhode Island School of Design, and subsequently founded the much renowned glass program at Rhode Island, or RISD as it's affectionately called, and taught there for more than a decade. He was fortunate enough to receive a Fulbright fellowship, which allowed him to really intensely study in the studios of Venice. So throughout his career, he's pushed the limits of glass in terms of production, size, installation. And so the image that you see with him is his ceiling at the famed Bellagio Hotel. And in the slide that I pull up here, at the Royal Botanical Gardens in London, my personal favorite instances of his works are one that interact with nature. But perhaps one of his greatest legacies is the founding of the Pilchuck Glass School outside of Tacoma, Washington, which has spawned a generation, maybe two generations of glass artists. Now, we've been talking, or I've been talking a lot about glass blowing, freeform glass blowing, mold blown glass, but there are more processes than just glass blowing. And so in glass, we often talk about processes being hot, cold, or warm. Cold being stained glass, hot being glass blowing. But there's also another process that's often more accessible to artists because a full-fledged furnace and studio isn't required. And that process is flameworking or lamp working that you see here. And in this process, small glass rods are melted and shaped and manipulated, by using a simple torch. And so the pieces are then annealed in an oven, just like you have in glass blowing, but pieces tend to be smaller and often just exquisitely detailed. I give you Giovanni Toso, who comes from a long and distinguished line of glass blowers from Murano, and was a maestro in Venetian glass blowing during the 60s and 70s. Here you see one of his signature chess sets, which pays homage to his dual heritage of both Judaism and Catholicism, with the religious figures on both sides of the chessboard sort of engaged in the kind of proverbial battle is a strong word, but set to try to outwit the other in skill. Now here in this slide, I show you the German-born Klaus Moyet, another pioneer of glass, but his work serves as an example of the warm process of fusing or kiln forming. So from a distance, these meticulously composed lines could almost be mistaken for painting or even textiles. But if you were to get up close and look at them, you would see that there were hundreds of narrow strips of glass painstakingly cut and assembled together. Then they are fused together in a kiln, sort of causing this subtle blend of color to kind of meld and really take that, that look of almost a textile-like surface. It's almost deceiving that these are hard edges from glass. But of course, one of the reasons that I was so delighted to have Gloria's invitation to do this presentation was not only to be able to talk about this intriguing art form, but to also talk about the incredible array of artists that are in SVAC's exhibition, and for those of you who are joining us locally, in your own backyard. The exhibition 2100 Degrees Fahrenheit, as Gloria mentioned, features the work of the Vermont Glass Guild. But make no mistake, this is no simple local art exhibition. These artists who live in Vermont, live and work in Vermont and the neighboring states, are some of the most accomplished glass artists nationally and internationally working today. The artist whose work you see here, Josh Simpson, interestingly, has been much influenced by his wife, Katie Coleman, who is a NASA astronaut. As you look at his pieces, you see that he creates these spectacular glass orbs inspired by the night sky and other astronomical phenomena. He's known for incorporating silver into his glass work, and this metal gives kind of his planets a tessellated pattern and iridescence. On the left, you see one of his mega planets from the Renwick collection at the Smithsonian, and to the right, you see this incredible piece, Space-Time Disk, that is in the SVAC's exhibition. Another internationally known artist who lives just across the border in Massachusetts is Robert Dane. He's a classically trained glass blower. As you can see from his Tutti Frutti goblet on the left, it's kind of a whimsical spin on the traditional Venetian style. But his more recent body of work, and what's on view at SVAC, is his glass sculpture. He relates his study of African and Cuban percussion and his love of jazz to the kind of improv dance that he does with his assistants in the glassmaking studio. As he says, it's all glass blowers have to respond to each other's movements and timing and action to create a finished piece, much like a highly choreographed dance. And one of the great for the SVAC exhibition was landing the work of Tutsinski. I could spend just the next hour alone talking about her accomplishments, but instead I'll mention that she is a pioneer in the field of glass and a founding member of Pilchuck School of Glass, along with Dale Chihuly, and also one of the co-founders of what's now Urban Glass in New York. She's been the recipient of two, not one, but two, National Endowment for the Arts grants, a Smithsonian Visionary Award, and the Glass Residency Program at the Corning Museum of Glass. Her work is collected in private collections and museums all around the world. And her trademark process, called filet de verre, which simply means glass threads, is a technique that she sort of invented and perfected from pulling incredibly thin, almost fiber optic thin threads of glass. It can be done by hand in a studio. I've witnessed her do it during an artist in residency, but more typically and more efficiently by a machine in her home studio. And then those thousands of threads are cut, assembled, layered, slumped, and that means sort of fused in a kiln over a particular form, and then fused again over another form until she gets the desired shape. So you see, I think you can see in this slide a hint of these very, very thin striations. Each one of those is a single thread of glass. This is the piece that is in our exhibition and is really I would say, the highlight of the show. But one of our visitor favorites is this seemingly whimsical piece by Robert de Grenier. Now, de Grenier has been working in glass for close to 4 decades and is in private collections around the world. But the pieces that you see here are from his Crabitat series. And as he tells it, they arose from a real life experience when he and his wife were vacationing on the beach in the Bahamas. And of course, the irony was that as he was sitting on the beach, he saw a little hermit crab crawl past, lodged in a broken Coke bottle. And while it was curious at first, it dawned on him that this unusual home was a matter of necessity, largely because we as humans feel compelled to collect shells, not necessarily realizing that this practice is impacting the ecosystem and robbing a creature of its natural habitat. So, of course, back in his home studio, he began creating shells out of glass. You can make them the right size, you can make them the desired thickness or thinness, and of course, they're non-porous. So he worked with a local pet store to see if the crabs would move in, but surprisingly, they weren't interested. So after much investigation, he realized that he was blowing the curve of the shell wrong, blowing it in the opposite direction because hermit crabs have a dominant claw, which impacts the way that they enter their own shell. So this wonderful melding of art and science has prompted him to work with marine biologists and work on sort of groundbreaking artist residencies up and down the New England coast and really exploring this whole idea of glass and marine habitats. So what's the future of glass? Are handmade functional objects still meaningful in our ultra-fast consumer society? Do we still appreciate objects of beauty just for their aesthetic appeal or their technical proficiency? I certainly believe so, but there's also an interesting trend that's emerging in glass that allows glass artists to look at societal and environmental issues. Amber Cowan, whose work you see in this slide, is an artist. Her sculptural glass work is built around the reuse of recycled, upcycled, and second life American pressed glass. She uses processes of flame working and hot sculpting to create these large scale sculptures that kind of overwhelm the viewer with this ornate abstraction. And the primary material used for her work is glass cullet that is sourced from scrap yards supplied by now defunct glass factories, flea markets, and antique stores. In this slide, actually an installation from Mass MoCA is the work by Spencer Finch. And in his installation, Cosmic Latte, he used over 150 light fixtures and over 400 incandescent hand-blown bulbs. The constellation of the lights are arranged in the shape of the Milky Way as it's observed from the northern hemisphere in the spring. And the work's title, Cosmic Latte, refers to the name that scientists have given the average color of the universe, which has recently been determined to be more beige than blue. And then finally, another artist with whom I've had the privilege of working is Norwood Viviano. And working with scientific agencies such as the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Viviano takes scientific data on sea level rise and projected storm intensities to visually illustrate just what visible cities could look like at 100, 200, or 500-year storm sea level rise. And I think the transparent medium of glass illustrates just how much land could be underwater in those type of climactic events. The resulting work is beautiful, but also sobering. So if you want more glass, as I mentioned, we've only scratched the surface in our hour together. There are many, many resources to see and experience. And while glass has been with us for thousands of years, it's also an ever-evolving medium. People spend a lifetime dedicated to mastering it and studying it. But if you want more, I have just a couple of favorite places, and you all probably have many more when we end. Hopefully you can chime in on some of them. From sort of near to far, Manchester Hot Glass right here in town, Robert de Grenier's glass studio in Townsend, Urban Glass in Brooklyn, Ignite in Chicago, and Pilchuck Glass School, if you are proficient, are incredible places to experience and create glass. A few, and only just a few, collections that are also paired with studios. My old stomping ground of the museum, Chrysler Museum of Art, and the Glass Studio in Norfolk, Virginia. If you haven't been to Corning Museum of Glass, go this year, go. And the Toledo Museum of Art that has an incredible glass history. Other exhibitions, and again, I limited this to what I could fit on one slide. The Morse Museum, if you like Tiffany, or the Queens Museum in New York, of course the Renwick at the Smithsonian, the Tacoma Art Museum if you're visiting the West Coast, and an exhibition with a few of the women that I've talked about, Amber Toots at the Sandwich Glass Museum. So truly, I hope you've enjoyed this very, very quick tour through 4,000 years of glass. But I hope if you didn't know all of these artists and processes before, that it's piqued your interest. And I've been delighted to be able to share some of my favorites with you this evening.
Thank you, Anne, so much. I have to say that I'm inspired to try a glass blowing class myself. And yeah, this was just amazing. I have to say that I love the exhibit at the Art Center. Tutzinski's work is amazing. So thank you very much.
Well, you're quite welcome. And for those of you who are local or at least regional, please come visit. I'd love to give you a tour of the show. Love for you to see it. It's up through August 22nd. Certainly won't be our last glass exhibition, but this one is particularly special. But many other places to see and experience glass, as I said, both near and far.
Okay, from Jennifer, what do you think happened to, is that Steuben or Steuben?
Oh, Steuben glass. Oh gosh, a great question. It was a prolific glass production, and was much sought after, much collected. Why one factory goes out, I think, had more to do with business practices than technical proficiency. And Steuben was absorbed, the name's escaping me right now, but absorbed by one of the larger factories. I'm blanking after blathering on for an hour, but I know that I'll forward that answer to Gloria to give to you.
Question from Jed. What were the forms made of that gave a smooth finish?
I'm not sure. Can we unmute Jed? I'm not sure if I'm understanding the question. If I think the smooth finish could have been the kiln formed pieces, could have been the blown pieces. I'm not sure which ones he was looking at. The pieces like Klaus Moyet were literally, sort of molded in a kiln, so that melting process creates a smooth surface. Glass blowing also, for the most part, creates a smooth surface, except for the pieces that are removed from the blowpipe. Those can, even in the most technically proficient, have sometimes jagged edges, and those are finished in the cold working process post production. I think I saw a question about Chihuly pop up.
Yes, from Jim Wilbur. How has Chihuly been so successful when having only one eye forced him to have his assistants realize the art pieces?
Oh, well, that is a terrific question, and it's one that has been the debate of every glass artist I've ever known. What's so special about Chihuly? Why does one artist become more famous than another? Yes, it's a tough question. There's no doubt that Dale Chihuly was a technically proficient glassblower. No doubt at all. The accident was, and he wasn't, those people who see him with an eye patch often think that, oh my goodness, he poked his eye out with a glass pipe. He didn't. He was in a car accident. It was just a random freak accident. But that does, of course, impact your depth perception, and his skill level, of course, was impacted to a point. It never made him, in my opinion, less of an artist, less of a visionary. Just it impacted his ability to create certain things. But of course, he was at a moment in his career where he was working with a team. But most glass blowers have to work with a team. It's a team process. You can't blow glass by yourself. One person's on a bench, one person is opening the door, another's holding the paddle. So he utilized that to his advantage and was at a moment in his career where he could work with some of the most technically proficient glass blowers around. Why he skyrocketed to fame while other artists haven't, that's impossible. I don't know. Why is Warhol so famous when other artists who are equally creative, what makes one more than another? That's the most vexing question in the art world. I don't have a great answer to that, but I think you understand my answer to a point. He had the means and the foresight to use everything and everyone around him.
Okay, Terry asks, of the glasswork you've done, is it cold or hot method? Do you have images of your work? And do you have a process that you favor?
Great question. Terry, I don't consider myself an artist. I dabble. I'm a student. I've always worked cold in glass. I've worked in stained glass. I've also done metal smithing, so I'm a little bit of the crafts person as opposed to an artist. But personally, as you can probably tell from this talk, I absolutely love glass blowing, first and foremost, more than anything. And I've been privileged to work around so many of the artists that I've mentioned this evening. So I've just been incredibly lucky in my career to be exposed to some of the greats.
you did mention Jamestown when you started talking about the American glass, and
Yes.
that made me smile because we do have a talk on Jamestown history coming up in December.
Oh, fantastic.
It'll be a three-part lecture series on Zoom. So we're excited about that.
Yeah, that's an interesting aspect of history. Jamestown, of course, is very close to Norfolk, and there, believe it or not, there is a Jamestown glass blowing studio, and the very talented glass artists there work in within the realm of their ability, work within sort of the historic techniques, trying to recreate glass using the tools and the furnaces as they would have during what I would say is that the Jamestown experiment in glass. It's a fascinating subject. I mean, we could do a lecture just on that itself, but
yeah.
So it's something to explore, Gloria. If people
Yes, absolutely. It might be a nice tie-in to that series that we're doing.
Yeah.
And I want to thank you again, Anne, for just a wonderful presentation. Thank you all for joining us. And please go to the Arts Center if you can and see the exhibit there, and then join us at the debate next week and at other of our lectures throughout the rest of the year. Thanks again and have a good night.
And thank you all for spending your evening with me. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you, Gloria, for the invitation.
You're welcome.